conclude the general introduction to linguistics, this video presents 7 basic facts about human language. Some of the facts might surprise you. Some of them you might even find hard to accept, but that may change as the course progresses and you learn more about linguistics. Fact number 1 is that there's more to perceiving language than just hearing it. To illustrate this point, take a look at the following video clip and try to hear what I'm saying. Make sure that you focus on my face.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
What did you hear me say? You might not all have heard the same thing, but most of you probably heard da da, da da, da da. At least, that's what you think you heard. Now I'll replay just the audio portion of the video clip, so that you can hear what I was actually saying.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
What do you hear now? It's not da da anymore, right? Now you're hearing ba ba. So why did it sound like da da when you watched the video? The trick is that the video was a composite. The sound was a recording of me saying ba ba, but the picture was a video of me saying da da. And the result was that you thought you heard me saying da da. This is an example of a perceptual illusion known as the McGurk effect. What's actually going on is that the brain is receiving conflicting inputs. The ears are telling the brain that they're hearing ba ba, but the eyes are telling the brain that they're seeing da da. In this case, the brain actually chooses to believe the eyes rather than the ears, and as a result, you think you hear da da even though you actually hear ba ba. The lesson here is that speech perception isn't as simple as you might expect. When your mind realizes that it's receiving a linguistic signal, it uses all available cues to figure out the content of the signal. Those cues include vision, in addition to hearing. Fact number 2 is that you have subconscious knowledge of your language. To see what this means, let's try a little experiment in syntax. We'll start with this sentence, I want you to leave. Let's try to emphasize this by adding the phrase very much. Is it possible to add very much at the end of the sentence? In that case, we'd say, I want you to leave very much, which sounds fine. Is it possible to add very much between I and want? In that case, we'd say, I very much want you to leave, which is also fine. What about adding very much after want? In that case, we'd say, I want very much you to leave. And unlike the other sentences, this one is not okay. Anyone who's a native speaker of English automatically knows that this is just not a possible sentence. You can't say it that way. Native speakers of English also automatically know how to fix it. We have to say, I want very much for you to leave, right? I want very much for you to leave. Somehow by adding the word for, the sentence becomes totally natural, even though the other versions of the sentence were completely fine without for. Now that was all very easy for anyone who speaks English as their native language, but here's the hard question. Why did you add for? Why does adding for fix the sentence? And how did you know that it would fix it? Unless you've had training in linguistics, you're not going to be able to answer that. So what do we learn from this little experiment? There's a grammatical rule in English that causes the word for to appear in certain contexts. Most native speakers of English have no idea what the rule actually is. They're not even aware that the rule exists until an example is pointed out to them. And yet, on some level, all native speakers of English do know this rule, because they consistently obey it. They know exactly when to add the word for, even if they don't realize that they know it. This is an example of subconscious knowledge of language. It's knowledge that you have in your head without realizing that you have it. There's a technical term that's used in linguistics to refer to your subconscious knowledge of your native language. It's called your linguistic competence. One of the major goals of linguistics is to understand what linguistic competence consists of. What exactly is the knowledge that you have in your head? And, just as importantly, how did that knowledge get there? Because most of your linguistic competence was never explicitly taught to you. The rule that inserts the word for in certain contexts, for example, is not something that a parent teaches to their child, and it's not even something that gets taught in school. It's just something that you automatically end up knowing by virtue of being a native speaker of English. We need to distinguish linguistic competence from a more concrete manifestation of language, the sentences that actually come out of your mouth. Linguistic competence is the knowledge of language that you carry in your head. Linguistic performance is the linguistic utterances that you actually produce. Performance is often an imperfect reflection of competence. That is, we often produce utterances that don't perfectly follow the linguistic system that we have in our head. Things like false starts, slips of the tongue, and dead-end sentences. But since there's no way to open up someone's mind and observe their competence directly, if we want to understand linguistic competence, our only option is to observe people's performance and try to figure out what their competence must be. This is the basic approach that's used in most linguistic research. Fact number 3 is that written language is secondary. When you learn about language in school, you usually focus on written language, reading and writing. But there are some big differences between written language and spoken or signed language. First, spoken or signed language is universal. It exists in every human culture. Written language, on the other hand, is not universal. Some cultures use writing, but there are lots of languages that are not usually written down. Second, spoken or signed language is acquired effortlessly by infants at a very young age. Babies almost instantly pick up whatever language is spoken around them. In fact, you can't even stop a baby from doing this. Written language, on the other hand, is learned later in school and is a much slower process that takes a lot of intellectual effort. Think of how much time is devoted to reading and writing in primary and elementary school. A 5-year-old still has a lot to learn about reading and writing, even though their speaking is pretty much already at an adult level. The third difference is that spoken or signed language is used proficiently by all humans, aside from people with certain special developmental conditions, whereas written language is not. Even in cultures that do use written language, there are usually some people who don't learn to read and write, along with people who don't become fully proficient in reading and writing. The fourth difference is that spoken language, as we've seen, involves mostly subconscious knowledge. When we speak, we follow a huge number of unspoken and unwritten rules that were never explicitly taught to us. Written language, on the other hand, involves conscious knowledge that was explicitly taught to us, such as the rules of spelling and punctuation that take years to learn in English class. If you think about these differences, what you have to conclude is that there's a sense in which writing is actually not very important. Spoken or signed language is a fundamental property of the human species. It's universal, and we easily reach full proficiency very early in life. Written language is very different. It's not universal, it's learned later, and it's relatively hard to learn. What written language really is just a system for recording spoken language. It's a way of taking something that is inherently spoken or signed and recording it in a physical form. This is obviously an extremely useful thing to be able to do. The invention of writing was one of the great achievements of humanity. But it's still an add-on. Writing is not the core of language. It's not central to what human language actually is, which is fundamentally a system for spoken or signed communication. Because of this, our focus in this course, as in most research in linguistics, will be on spoken and signed language, not on written language. Fact number 4 is that all languages are equal. Here are a couple of questions to think about. Are some languages better than others? Are there languages out there that are primitive and rudimentary? The answer to both questions is no. Linguists have studied languages from all over the world in great depth, and what we find is that all languages are equally sophisticated and equally well adapted to be used for communication. Despite the obvious differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar, all of the world's languages are similar in fundamental ways. They all share the same basic design features that you saw in the last video. Because of these fundamental similarities, it's been suggested that if an alien linguist were to visit the Earth, they might conclude that all humans actually speak the same language, just in a bunch of different dialects. And there's nothing that makes any of these better than any of the others. Fact number 5 is that there's no such thing as bad grammar. Take a look at the following 2 sentences. Which one would you say shows better grammar? She doesn't have anything, or she ain't got nothing. Obviously, if this was an English class, you'd want to say that sentence A is better. But to a linguist, that's not the case. To a linguist, both of these sentences are equally good. They're just examples of 2 different linguistic systems. A person who says things like sentence A has one system, and a person who says things like sentence B has a different system. And there's no objective reason to say that one system is better than the other. Obviously, our society prefers one system over the other, and you can learn more about why if you take Linguistics 1010 next semester. But from a purely linguistic perspective, both systems are equally good. As linguists, we want to study human language as it is. Language the way people actually use it, in all its many varieties. We want to understand the full diversity of human language, not just the ways of speaking that currently happen to be favored by society. This brings us to an important distinction between 2 approaches to grammar: prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar. Prescriptive approaches to grammar involve making statements about how people should speak. That is, about what's the correct way to use language. Things like, don't end a sentence with a preposition, or don't split an infinitive, or say he and I went, not me and him went. Descriptive approaches to grammar, on the other hand, involve making statements about how people actually do speak. We've seen one example in this video. Native speakers of English automatically add the word for to a sentence in certain particular contexts. The field of linguistics is 100% descriptive. Linguists want to understand the knowledge that's in your head, no matter how you speak or how people think you should speak. And it turns out that the knowledge that you carry around in your head is so much richer and so much more interesting than arbitrary rules like don't split an infinitive. This is not what grammar really is. Fact number 6 is that languages are always changing. Every generation speaks slightly differently from their parents. People often worry about this. Is it a good thing that language keeps changing, or is it a bad thing? Well, for the most part, there's no indication that it's a good thing. Languages have been changing for many millennia, but overall, the languages that are spoken today are not particularly different in terms of complexity or usefulness from the languages that were spoken 6,000 years ago. But there's also no indication that it's a bad thing. Language change doesn't harm language. If language change really was harmful to language, human communication would have broken down millennia ago, because languages have always been changing. Nevertheless, even though most language change doesn't seem to be either good or bad, many people have a strongly negative reaction to it. So we have charities that try to defend English against declining standards, and we can read articles about how it's actually the decline of the English language that caused Donald Trump to be elected. That sounds serious. Is English really going downhill? Well, lots of people think so. Here are some quotations. The vocabularies of the majority of high school pupils are amazingly small. From every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Our language is degenerating very fast. Okay, that sounds really serious, but let's take a look at the dates of these quotations. The most recent one is from a century ago. People have been fretting about the decline of English for a very long time, but English hasn't actually gone downhill. Just because we no longer speak as we did in 1795 or 1917 doesn't mean anything's gone wrong. What we're seeing here is just an example of the general phenomenon in which the older generation complains about all the terrible things the younger generation is doing. But as far as language is concerned, there's nothing to worry about. Language change is just something that naturally happens. It applies constantly to all languages, and it doesn't harm language. Fact number 7 is that there's no way to define a language. How many languages exist in the world? If you looked it up, you'd find that there are about 7,000 languages, although the number is steadily decreasing. But another answer is possible. You could also say that there are 7.8 billion languages, and the number is steadily growing. 7.8 billion is, of course, the population of the Earth. The reason for saying that there are 7.8 billion languages is that no two people have exactly the same linguistic system in their head. Everyone has minor differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. So we all speak slightly different languages. This may seem like a totally pedantic point, but it does have a meaningful consequence. Since we all speak slightly different languages, there's no principled way to differentiate one language from another. The best we can do is to use a criterion known as mutual intelligibility. Basically, you just ask, these two people who speak using two different linguistic systems, can they understand each other? That's what we mean by mutually intelligible. They can understand each other. If the answer is yes, then we say that the two people are speaking two dialects of the same language. A dialect, by the way, is just a regional variety of a particular language. If the answer is no, they can't understand each other, then we say that the two people are speaking two distinct languages. The mutual intelligibility criterion usually works pretty well. For example, if you take someone who speaks only English and someone who speaks only Arabic, they're not going to understand each other. Their speech is not mutually intelligible. So we conclude that English and Arabic are distinct languages, which is obviously the right conclusion. But it's not always this easy. What if you took someone who speaks Canadian English and someone who speaks Scottish English? The Canadian speaker might actually have a fair bit of trouble understanding the Scottish speaker, so we might not have full mutual intelligibility. But at the same time, it's probably going to be easier for a Canadian English speaker to understand the Scottish English speaker than it would be to understand an Arabic speaker. So this is the first problem with the mutual intelligibility criterion. It's not always a yes or no thing. There are degrees of mutual intelligibility. The second problem is that in actual usage, the mutual intelligibility criterion often gets overridden for political reasons. Here are two examples. First example, Swedish and Norwegian are mutually intelligible. So, by rights, they should be regarded as dialects of the same language. But they're not. Swedish and Norwegian are normally said to be distinct languages. The second example, Mandarin and Cantonese are not mutually intelligible. So by rights, they should be regarded as distinct languages. And sometimes they are, but it's also common to see them described as two dialects of a single language called Chinese. In both of these cases, the classification based on mutual intelligibility is ignored. And the reason for this is political. Can you think of what the reason would be in each case? Well, for Swedish and Norwegian, the reason is that Sweden and Norway are separate countries. Even though Swedish and Norwegian could technically be called dialects of the same language, nobody wants to say that their national language is actually a dialect of some other country's national language. So Swedish and Norwegian get called distinct languages, but it's really only because they're associated with distinct countries, not for any purely linguistic reason. With Mandarin and Cantonese, it's exactly the opposite. Even though they're really distinct languages, they're both spoken in China, which is one country. So for purposes of national unity, some people prefer to say that it's all the same language. Everyone's speaking Chinese. They're just speaking it in very different ways. Again, this is a matter of politics. One country, one language. This is a pretty common phenomenon, and there's a well-known quote by a Russian linguist that sums it up. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. When push comes to shove, the distinction between languages and dialects is often based on politics and national identity rather than on actual linguistic factors like mutual intelligibility. In this video, you've seen an assortment of different facts about language. In addition to raising your consciousness about various properties of language, the video also introduced some important linguistic terms that you should make sure you understand. In particular, the distinction between competence and performance, the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive approaches to language, and the distinction between languages and dialects. This concludes Lecture 1.